When I was learning the recorder at about the age of 7 or 8, my teacher taught me this mnemonic to remember which notes came on which lines of the musical stave when reading sheet music. And the notes are E, G, B, D, F, which she told us stood for every good burger deserves fries, which is brilliant and really helped me remember it. But it does mean now whenever I try and read sheet music, it just makes me hungry. But the thing is, that is only true for sheet music that has a very particular symbol at the beginning. And that symbol is this one. Now, even if you're not musical at all, you've almost certainly seen this symbol before. And most people, if asked, would tell you it's called a treble clef. And in pretty much any page of standard Western musical notation, every line will begin with a symbol called a clef. And a clef is basically a key that tells you how the notes on the stave are laid out. And the treble clef is by far the most common, both because loads of musical instruments use it, but also because it's become the default clef for when you're not writing for any particular instrument, you're just writing out a melody. You will almost certainly see that written with a treble clef at the beginning. Another clef you may well have seen is the bass clef, and this is used on the left hand of the piano, but also for low instruments such as the bassoon, cello, bass, trombone, tuba, all those kind of things. And then there are the weird ones, these fellas, the alto and tenor clefs. They're nowhere near as ubiquitous as the treble or bass clefs. In fact, it's probably fair to say that most musicians don't even learn to read sheet music notated with these clefs fluently, unless they have a specific need to do so. The most famous use case for the alto clef is when you're playing the viola, which is the slightly larger and deeper sibling of the violin, and that uses the alto clef as its main default clef. The tenor clef isn't used by default for any instrument, but instruments like the cello, bassoon, and trombone will sometimes switch into it when they're playing higher pitched passages. But the thing you'll notice when you see all of these clefs together is that they each have a very different fancy symbol. Apart from the alto and tenor clef, which use the same symbol, but just shifted up the stave, you would think that somebody somewhere along the centuries would have found the time to design each of them their own symbol. So how did we end up reusing the same thing? And what do these symbols even mean anyway? Now, before we dig into the despised alto and tenor clef, the losers, let's start with everyone's favourite, their Royal Highness, the treble clef. What does this symbol actually mean? Okay, we've already said that it maps out where the notes are on the stave, but let's remove the stave lines for a moment. Let's just look at the symbol. What does that symbol actually mean? The answer, which you might not expect, is G. That's literally it. It's just a very fancy letter G, which is a bit confusing, right? Because as we've already said, you see that symbol at the beginning of basically any piece of music, no matter what key it's in, no matter what notes there are, no matter what chords, they all start with this fancy letter G. So what does it mean? Because it doesn't mean play a G. Well, when you put it back on the stave, the G is actually referring to a very specific line. It's the one that it's kind of cradling like Blofeld with his white cat. And that line is always the note G. In fact, more specifically, it's always the G above middle C. And that's why you'll sometimes hear the treble clef referred to as a G clef. So what does that mean for the bass clef? Because we know that when the bass clef is present, the notes on the stave are all in different places. Is that just a letter as well? Well, yeah, it is. It's a letter F. And that F is referring to the line between the two dots. That line that it's kind of kissing there is always the F below middle C. So if the treble clef is a G clef, and the bass clef is an F clef, which is very fun to say, what on earth of the alto and tenor clef? Is that really a letter? Well, believe it or not, that symbol is a letter C. Now, that symbol has changed a lot over the centuries, but to be honest, when you look at the older versions, it doesn't get any clearer. You just have to believe me, it's a C. And as you can probably guess, the line where the two loopy loops do a bit of a fist bump is middle C. And crucially, that is true for both the alto clef and the tenor clef. The notes are still all in different positions as they are with the other clefs, but that line where the fist bump happens is always middle C in both cases. So you could argue that the alto clef and the tenor clef are actually the same thing. They're just an anchor on middle C, but you're just scrolling up and down the lines a bit. And if you can do that with the C clef, why can't you do that with the others? The thing is, our 4 clefs were only really standardised in the 19th century, when sheet music, largely as we know it, was around in medieval times. A major difference back then was that clefs were all movable and would be shuffled around depending on the particular needs of the instrument and the piece being played. And you could find a variety of clefs in use back then. G clefs and F clefs like we have now were common. You could even find some D clefs and A clefs in rare situations. But arguably the medieval monarch of the movable clef was the now dethroned C clef. This clef was so normalized that you didn't just see it in the alto and tenor positions where we use it now, but you'd see it on any line of the stave. It could be a soprano clef, mezzo-soprano, alto, tenor, or even baritone. You would get choral scores that just used the C clef, shifted to an appropriate position for each voice type. The F and G clef didn't move around quite so wildly, but they did move. For example, if you take the F clef in its bass clef position and move it down a line, you get an alternative baritone clef. And if you take the G clef in its treble clef position and move it down to the bottom line of the stave, you get what was known as the French violin clef, because it was often used for violin music in France. An example that shows all these in action really well is a piece by Couperin called L'Apotheose de Lully. Coming from the 1720s, this piece was actually a later example for these clefs, but it's useful because Couperin was actively trying to contrast French music with Italian music, and he did that both with the sounds but also with the written clefs. A flick through the score will bring up our familiar treble clef and bass clef, but we also get an awful lot of that French violin clef. It's often labelled in the score as clef Françoise to differentiate it from clef italienne, and sometimes it's just clef changé when you need to flick between the two. And you'll also see the C clef in use, sometimes as the alto clef, but an awful lot as the soprano clef on the bottom line in the stave. And if you're listening to this thinking, all of this must have been really confusing for these poor musicians who had to learn to read all of these different clefs fluently, eventually, history agreed with you. By the mid-classical period, the desire for simplicity was beginning to win out, and the clefs as we know them today were beginning to become standard. But it is true that not all instruments have a range that fits nicely with these standard clefs, particularly higher instruments like the piccolo. The way around that in modern notation is we keep our clefs standard, but we use octave shifts. If you look at a piece of piccolo music, for example, you might sometimes see an 8 over the treble clef. And that just means that it's all transposed up. So where you would normally see middle C on a treble clef stave, that now means the C above middle C. These octave shifts are so well understood though, that if you look at a piece of piccolo music which is shifted an octave up, or a piece of bass clarinet music which is shifted an octave down, often that little 8 is just left out. It's just assumed to be there. Which means that the C clef, now only really seen as the alto clef and the tenor clef, is perhaps unjustly pushed to the sidelines and hated by music theory students across the world, as well as student bassoonists who are outraged to find out they have to learn a second clef. Bluntly, they've survived more through tradition than utility. They keep a continuity with the past centuries of sheet music, which is important, but they also build friction into the system, putting student violinists off moving over to the viola because of the big, scary, unknown clef. But if you want to take a really pedantic fact away from this, that will make everybody hate you if you bring it up in conversation, if you follow through the logic, this is not a treble clef. It only becomes a treble clef when you put it in position on the stave. If you take that away, it's just a G clef. It's just a fancy G. And you're a fancy G too. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider subscribing. I'm very close to 1,000 subscribers, which will be a great milestone to hit. You can also buy me a coffee if you'd like to see these videos coming out more regularly, and I'll see you in the next one.